Brian, thank you so much for that introduction. So I've had the privilege of studying high-performing technology organizations for, 27 years. And that was a journey that started back when I was the CTO and founder of a company called Tripwire, where I was for 13 years as the CTO and founder. And our goal was to, back in 1999, study these high-performing technology organizations that simultaneously had the best project due date performance and development, that had the best operational reliability and stability in operations, as well as the best posture of security and compliance. And so naturally, we wanted to understand how did those amazing organizations make their good to great transformations, right, so that we could understand how other organizations could replicate those amazing outcomes. And so as you can imagine, in a journey that spanned over 30 decades, there were many surprises, but one of the biggest surprises until recently was how it took me into the middle of the DevOps movement. And for many of you, you might not be able to remember a day when organizations only deployed once a year, right? And, in the 2000s, right, that's what was typical, right? And then in 2009, John Allspaw, Paul Hammond at Flickr talked about how they're doing 10 deploys every day as part of their daily work. And they shared that presentation at the Velocity conference in a room very much like this. And by all accounts, for the people who were there, they thought that was like crazy, right? Reckless, irresponsible, maybe even immoral, right? Like, what sort of maniac would deploy 10 times a day when, like, if you deploy once a year, like, the results are so terrible. And yet, over the last, 20 years, the DevOps principles and patterns have made, daily deployments very much a part of most organizations' daily work. And so I thought I had a lot of fun in my career, but I never thought I would have more fun than that until recently when I met Steve Yegge. And we worked on a book called Vibe Coding. And so what I want to talk about in the next 20 minutes is really share with you what I learned working with Steve Yegge, which was probably the beginning of the most incredible adventure I've ever been on in my life. And I think Vibe Coding will reshape technology organizations just like DevOps did, but so much bigger. I'll share with you what I've learned in that. And some of you may be skeptical about vibe coding, that vibe coding will only generate slop, right? And I'm going to share with you that I too was skeptical, but I'll share with you some formative stories that I had that changed my mind, and maybe will change yours as well. And then I'll talk a little bit about what I think it's going to do for not just developers, but the organizations that developers are part of, and the concentric ring of what it does to everyone who depends on technology, which is basically every organization. And so, as Brian mentioned, Furtado mentioned, we got to work on the Phoenix project, the DevOps handbook, and then I meet Steve Yegge in the June of 2025. And I've been an admirer of his work for almost 15 years, right, because of primarily this memo, right? And so, he described this memo that was written by Jeff Bezos, by his accounts, the most audacious memo that Jeff Bezos ever wrote. And it was really what forced, the API-ification and the modularization of the Amazon e-commerce code base. So, if you can imagine in the late 90s, Amazon is doing, daily deployments, tens of deploys per day. Right by the early 2000s, after a period of hypergrowth, they can only do about 10 deployments a year. Right, most deployments didn't actually finish, right, because something always went wrong. And every small change, you would have to communicate and coordinate with 3,500 other developers within Amazon. And so out comes this memo that says, all teams must henceforth communicate and coordinate only through APIs. No other interfaces would be allowed, right? Anyone who doesn't do this will be fired. And then number 7 ends with thank you and have a nice day. And so the person who wrote this was Steve Yegge. He said, number 7 is obviously a joke because Bezos doesn't actually care whether you have a good day or not. Right, but everything else is true, right? It was actually enforced by then Amazon CIO Rick Dalzell, former Army U.S. Ranger. And so what's funny about the story is that this was actually meant to be an internal memo published inside of Google. So he spent 20 years at Amazon and Google, but he accidentally made it public, and thus landing him on the front page of the Wall Street Journal. And this is like a typical Yegge thing. Anyway, so it turns out when we met, one of the things that we had in common was that not just our love of modularity and APIs, but also this love of using AIs for coding. So we ended up working on this book called the Vibe Coding book. And our belief and observation is that AI will reshape technologies or organizations in a way that makes DevOps look like a drop in the bucket. Because whenever you have a mode of production breakthrough like this, the entire economy rearranges itself around this new mode of production. And so I actually was very inspired by what I think it was Maya said, that only crises can cause change because bureaucracies are so powerful. But sometimes there are technology forces that are so powerful, even most highly evolved bureaucracies are powerless to stop it. And I think we're starting to see amazing case studies of just what is possible by this. And so this, David Cockcroft, he was famous for his work as the cloud architect at Netflix. And so back in the late 90s, 2009, Amazon, all their infrastructure was in a data center. And so he led the migration to the Amazon cloud. And he, in this article that he posted last May, he said, you know what, way back in 2012, a lot of people in the DevOps movement called it no-ops, right? Because people would sort of joke that we don't need operations and infrastructure anymore, right? And so, people sort of laugh at that. But he said, with this notion of vibe coding, every engineer is like a director of development. Maybe we should call it no-dev. Right? Not so funny anymore, right? It just shows how kind of mean-spirited we are within the technology community. But I think it is so true, right? And so when you have these, what I think DevOps did is that, when you go from deploying once a year to deploying every day, suddenly everyone's job changes, right? It was QA or infrastructure operations or information security or even product. And so this is what we found in the state of DevOps research. So this is the work that I got to do with Dr. Nicole Forsgren and Jez Humble. This was a cross-population study that spanned over 36 respondents from 2013 to 2019. And what we found was that it really was true. These high performers, they were deploying multiple times a day, so that's 2 orders of magnitude more quickly than their peers. They're deploying in 1 hour or less, right? Again, 2 orders of magnitude more quickly than their peers. They get far better outcomes than when they do a deployment. They're 7 times more likely to succeed without causing a step 1 outage, a service impairment, a security breach, or compliance failure. And when something goes wrong, they can fix it in 1 hour or less. And so again, that's 3 orders of magnitude faster than the peers. And so and back then in 2013, what made this work so exciting was that it showed that you can do smaller deployments more frequently and get better reliability outcomes. In fact, the only way you can get those amazing reliability outcomes is to do smaller deployments more frequently. So of course, we now know that when you can integrate information security objectives into everyone's daily work, you spend 1/2 the amount of time remediating security issues. You're more likely to exceed profitability, market share, and productivity goals. And for this audience, right, for government agencies, for military services, not-for-profits, same multiple performance. You're twice as likely to achieve organizational and mission goals, right, regardless of how you measure it. And so, the lesson really is, it's like if mission achievement requires work that we do in the technology value stream, then DevOps helps with the enablement of those objectives. Another marker is that, when you can, have these practices in place, you're more likely to recommend your organizations as a great place to work to your colleagues and friends, right? As opposed to, those organizations that can't build, can't test, can't deploy, can't get logs, can't get, license keys, whatever, right? It's terrible, right? You would never recommend your friends to work there. So all that says, and I think I just really applaud those wonderful case studies from this morning. It just says, these are the things that allow us to safely, quickly, reliably, securely achieve all the goals, dreams, and aspirations of the organizations that we serve. And so, DevOps did reshape technology organizations. And I think vibe coding can do that even more. And I just, before I leave this, I just want to show just a couple, for those skeptics who say, in GovTech, we can't do it here. You may know of all these commercial case studies, whether it's Adidas or Vanguard or Pfizer, Toyota. For those who say, we can't do it here, one of my favorite case studies, besides Kessel Run, of course, is Captain Andy Bean. He was then the Aegis program owner in the US Navy. And the problem that he set out to solve was that deployment was really hard, right? You have to, on ships, you have to wait 6 to 8 years for major ship refits. You then have to cut holes in steel bulkheads. You have to wheel the computers out and then, deploy the software. I've met people whose jobs it was to rappel down onto submarines from a helicopter, with a backpack full of hard drives. Anyway, so they virtualized the Aegis system. They enabled over-the-air updates. Right, and the USS Winston Churchill had the first over-the-air update while deployed in the Red Sea. Right, just showing that, in my mind, the reason why I'm sharing this with you is that if you can do it there, you can do it anywhere, right? So, I'll say, whatever objections you have, right, might not be as severe as the objections that now Rear Admiral Andy Bean faced. And then here's Lieutenant Colonel Max Reel sharing about the work that we got to do studying software practices across the then US DoD, over 35 organizations, just showing that these things are possible almost anywhere, and we can sort of identify which are the conditions where it will or won't work. So, so that's about the DevOps work. And so, I want to share with you this quote from Dr. Eric Meyer. So he is considered by many to be the greatest programming language designer of all time. So he's part of Visual Basic, part of C#, Link, Hack. He was a functional programming researcher, the Scala call out over there. I love that. But he said, he's basically spent his entire career building programming languages for humans. And he said about a year and a half ago, we are probably going to be the last generation of developers to write code by hand, right? So we better have fun doing it. And so, the reason why Steve Yegge and I were so, startled by this is why would someone who's spent his whole career, writing programming languages for humans say something like this? And he substantiated why in this quote. He said, time can be neither generated or stored. And so if we as programmers can find a way to save time, we have to take it. And it's just amazing to see where this adventure is taking Dr. Eric Meyer. More on him later. And so I mentioned meeting Steve Yegge in June 2025. June 2024. Geez, time flies. Okay, so he made an offer to me in September 2024, which was basically, hey, let's pair program together. I'm like, holy cow, right? What an amazing opportunity. And so the natural question was what do you want to work on, right? And I knew exactly what to work on. I listen to a lot of YouTube videos and podcasts, and whenever I hear something interesting, I'll take a screenshot of it, right? In the hopes that I'll go back and maybe look up, make a citation, write about it. And it turns out on my phone, I have something like 6,000 screenshots. How many times though have I actually gone back and actually looked something up? It's about 5, right? So I was like, okay, Steve, here's what I want to do. I have a whole pile of screenshots of of YouTube videos, and I want to be able to sort of take the transcript, the video. I want to be able to generate highlights, right, with overlaid captions. And what was amazing to me was that we were able to build it in 47 minutes, right? And so I've been wanting to do this for over a decade. And just whenever I sort of thought about it, I was like, the juice isn't worth the squeeze, right? So for a decade to be able to wish for it, to actually having built it, that changes your life. And I remember texting Steve that night saying, oh my gosh, I got it working. The video I chose to make was Dr. Eric Meyer's talk, the coolest part of that was that Eric Meyer responded back saying, oh my gosh, this is great. What a great way to get the highlights, so much better than listening to it at 2x speed, which is so thrilling for me. And incidentally, it got 250,000 views. To me, it was interesting because it meant that other people found what Eric had to say interesting. And so, I think it was in that moment, September 2024, when I realized this is something that is going to be really, really important, and you can pry it out of my dead, cold hands, right? This is the way I want to program. And so our definition of vibe coding is basically anything besides typing in code by hand. Where you're actually keying it in like a primitive, cave person. What's interesting is the definition I really wish we had before we wrote the book was one that from Dario Amodei, who wrote the foreword to the vibe coding book. He said vibe coding is on one hand inspired but also misleading. He said it's inspiring because it evokes this totally different way of writing code, right? Where you write what you want and the AI writes it for you. But he says it's also a problem because it sounds jokey and unserious or frivolous. But he said at Anthropic, where we have some of the best developers on the planet, right, it is the only game in town. It's oh my gosh, I have goosebumps just listening to that. I mean, I think it shows why it's so important. And so, back in 2024, 2025, it was amazing to see Steve Yegge just burning $300 to $500 on tokens, per day. And even looking back now, it's it just seems so cute, right? It's what developer isn't burning $300 to $500 per day, right? That's what the Claude Max, subscriptions are for. In fact, as I've heard so many times that, as an engineer, my job is to burn the equivalent of my salary, my daily salary on tokens. In other words, right, that means I have to line up work at night so that when I wake up in the morning, I can see what it wrote, right? That is how I can get maximum leverage out of this, new technology, right? So if there's this machine that can build heavy, that can lift heavy things, right? I shouldn't be lifting heavy things. And so, it's in the last year, I can't believe how much I've written. Someone asked what's most fun for me these days? It's oh my gosh, it's writing code. This all seems so quaint now. Right before our vibe coding workshop in September, Steve and I were preparing for the workshop, and we just had an hour at the end of the day. What should we do? And he was let's vibe code something. Let's do something that is sort of beyond what we've ever done. And I was you know what? I'd like to write a YouTube podcast player. Had use the Expo framework, had the YouTube player working in 20 minutes, the podcast player working in 40 minutes, right? And all running in the simulator, was running my phone the next week. For a little while, it was my daily driver. But then I realized I don't actually want to listen to podcasts anymore. I actually want to have someone summarize and make newsletters of all my feeds. Wrote a Slack archiver, history viewer, blah, blah. I mean, these are things that were solving problems. But I think that I want to share with you 2 stories. So here's how I spent Super Bowl Sunday this year. This is Dr. Mike Stone. He was a ER doc at Harvard Medical for 20 years. And we've been talking for a couple of months, and he said, what I would really love is to have an LM go through my patient records. He's a private practice now, so he can better prep for the meetings, make sure the patients are on goal. And so I said, okay. Here's go get an API key for your EHR systems. He did all of that, right? He got his HIPAA BAA certified something right on Google Cloud. And so on Super Bowl Sunday, we spent 6 hours exploring what we could do with it. And I just want you to know, right? There were a couple of times when I said, you know what, I'm not your guy. I'm not going to be the reason why all your patient data gets leaked on the internet. No, thank you. And yet, I found that I felt like we could do this in a very judicious and safe way. And what's amazing is, we got a bunch of ETL batch jobs. We gave LLMs tool calling, and it's amazing watching it sort of rifle through all the patient records, going through the lab notes, and do it in a way that I would consider safe. I left it on. There's no way I would have left it on. Had I not felt it was safe. Anyway, so a specific moment was when Mike Stone. I gave a prompt like, I am Mike Stone, the doctor in the repo. I'm not a developer, but if there are changes in the front end that don't touch the ETL jobs or the back end, let me deploy it. And so while I was watching, ironically, The Pit with my wife, he did his first deployment without my help. I'm like, wow. I think this is just a glimpse of what is coming, right? Is that non-developers, can do high-fidelity prototypes, saying exactly what they want, right? And I'm just, sometimes I'm the plumber in the back, connecting the pipes, or sometimes they can do it themselves. I have another story to share, just because it was so impactful to me. So a couple of weeks ago, I did a vibe coding workshop for the U.S. Navy. And it was amazing to see all these switched-on young officers, visualizing data. And we're going to do something very similar today in the practitioner workshop for non-developers, and we're going to do something similar for developers, but more. So that was pretty cool, right? But it was not as cool as what happened that evening, where essentially the team from Signal Defense, who had sponsored it, was telling their CEO of a $500 billion a year company what they did. Right? And he started complaining about this pickleball application. He's an avid pickleball player and organizer. He says, I hate this app, right? And he starts showing me how bad it is. And he spends, the words I'll never forget is like, I spend more time in Google Sheets dealing with player RSVPs than playing pickleball, right? And so I remember saying, why don't we get together 90 minutes next week and we'll build it together. But there was this purchasing officer from some agency. He said, you know what? Normally, we would put out a request for bid for 1,300 hours to do that, and I just spit out my drink. I'm like, nothing takes 1,300 hours. Next thing you know, right, I take out my laptop, I tether my phone, and the next 2 hours, we have this is obviously a little more productionized, but we have the ideal pickleball application. So like in user-centered design, I love the stories today where, the user is showing glee, right, and satisfaction using the software. Look at Matt Jones's face, right, as he realizes that, what is possible and that he could build it himself. And I guess, and so for all of you, right, it's like, can you imagine, working with your users, your customers, and having that expression on his face? And he's actually presenting the full fidelity of his case study next week at the conference I'm running, the Enterprise AI Summit. And basically, I love what he said. He said, if you, 6 weeks ago, he didn't care much about AI. That's what he told his board. Now, that's all he cares about, right? It's like, how can we get you have to be either the person building the solution or you have to be either, as Ken Beck would say, the person with the problem or the person fixing the problem. If you're not one of those two, what value are you adding? And I want to share one more thing on this is that, so both Dr. Mike Stone and Matt Jones aren't developers. But what's surprising to me is they both created GitHub accounts, and they both started posting these high-fidelity ASCII art mockups, well-thought-through features. They understand the why, right? And it's just beautiful, right? And so, if you had told me 6 months ago that this is what non-developers would be doing, I would have laughed, right? I think we sort of hinted at it in the book, but to see it actually happening is something else entirely. And so my son, when I told him about this, he said, Dad, isn't this all encroaching on your craft, which you spent 40 years getting good at? And I was like, no, this is like the most amazing thing ever, right? We are liberating people to solve their own problems, right? And we as developers is to enable that, so that they can do it safely. All right, so what is the value of vibe coding? In the book, we say there's really 5 dimensions, and we call it FAFO. And I'll go through each one of these dimensions. So first is faster, right? There's no doubt that AI can type code faster than you, right? But I think that is the most superficial value that vibe coding enables. But there is some value in speed. But I think the more valuable thing is that it allows you to do things that are more ambitious, right? So take that video excerpting application, that cute thing that I wrote back in September 2024. I've wanted to do that for a decade, but I just knew that was going to take 4 days, 5 days, maybe weeks. It involved FFmpeg. I've used FFmpeg enough where I just knew that was just like not going to go to good places. And I think there's really 2 values of this. One is that the impossible becomes possible, right? It's now within reach. So there's definitely value to that. But there's also, on the other side of the spectrum, is these small things become almost free. And so Kat Wu, one of the founders of Claude Code, she said there's this practice that they have in Anthropic where basically a customer issue comes in, and instead of putting it in a Jira backlog and arguing about, do we do it this week or next week, we just do it, and it's in production 30 minutes later, or in a production-like environment. And so, what does it mean when small things can just become free, right? So there's faster, more ambitious. And the third one is like autonomous and alone. Right? There are so many things that people can do by themselves, or teams can do by themselves. So like in many of your organizations, to do something that you want done, you have to coordinate and communicate with other scores of other teams. And there's something about vibe coding that allows you to do things that don't require functional specialists, like the infrastructure engineers, like the front-end engineers, right? These are things that every team can now do more by themselves. And so that reduces coordination cost. So there's faster, ambitious, autonomous, alone, and fun. Holy cow, there's something really addictive about vibe coding. The combination of like building something that you want built and the danger of like things going wrong, right? The adrenaline and dopamine is a very lethal cocktail. And so as Kent Beck said, I'm coding at 2 a.m. for the first time in decades. There's a reason for that. And then the last one is optionality. And that means you can have more swings at bat. You can research more alternatives. You can prototype more ideas. And if I had more time, I would tell you about NK divided by T and sigma. Maybe I'll share that in the workshop. But basically, there's a school of thought that says creating option value is the most powerful economic lever there is. So if you've heard of A/B testing or modularity, right? All that creates economic value because it gives you the right but not the obligation to take an action. So AIs are bad at many things. They're notoriously bad at instruction following. They're bad at context window saturation. They're bad at something else, right? And so you as a developer, right, have to be very cognizant about this because if you don't, you do things like this, where you accidentally drop. He didn't just drop a table. He deleted the entire production database in AWS. But despite all the danger, right, I still give Claude Code direct access to my production databases, even though it has at times corrupted data, deleted data, because the payoff is so high. That's what backups are for, right? It's like, why do you back up if you're not willing to restore it? So it's a very, to get that kind of leverage out of AI is just amazing. And from an organizational perspective, what do you do when you have a population of developers that are an order of magnitude more productive than other developers? Andy Glover, director of dev productivity at OpenAI, said, like even at the frontier labs, right, there were developers who still like writing code by hand. And so, I think the challenge coming up is like, how do we elevate everyone's productivity so everyone can be, doing things like we talked about, and it requires great technical practices. Modularity matters more than ever. Fast feedback loops more than ever, and a culture of learning. You just have to love learning, and I think that the danger here is that all our instincts that worked for us when we were on foot, where our maximum speed was like 5 to 15 miles an hour, are profoundly unsuitable when we're going 50 or 150 miles an hour. Right? And so we just have to learn kind of there's a different way of working that creates a whole different set of instincts that are, but however, based in engineering principles that we will all find familiar. I will just say this. We have I mentioned this conference that we're running in April 9 and 10. And if you take a look at some of the companies, one of them that is really interesting to me is Netflix. as my friend Amy Willard, who's a senior director at John Deere, said, we all got rebooted at the same time. It doesn't matter whether you're at a startup, a FANG, a 150-year-old industrial company, or in government. Like, we all got rebooted at the same time. No one knows anything right now, right? And so the value of knowing something is so amazing, and I hope that I've convinced you that there's something really valuable here, and that there's so much to learn and there's so much value that we can get. So I'm doing 2 workshops later today. One is for practitioners. So when I was talking with Furtado, the notion was these are for non-developers, right? We're going to create visualization applications. Everyone's going to leave with having built something, and then we're going to have vibe coding for engineers, which is going to be a superset of that, where we're not only going to build cool applications, but we're going to learn just some methods to make sure that you will never be copying and pasting anything in and out of AIs. And so if this has been of interest, just send, if you want links to all the videos I've referenced, if you want links to excerpts of the book, just send an email to realgenekim@sendyourslides.com, subject line vibe, and you'll get an automated response in a minute or 2. Thank you so much.